I like it even when you let it go like this, because I love how it looks cute, and I love it when it's like that, because it's like a free spirit.
Try to keep it under control. I don't think you can.
Yeah, well.
Try to be free spirit for a while.
So we're going to begin our workshop, everybody, and I want to introduce our speaker today is Kennedy Syfax, and she is from a funeral home over in Portland called Jones, Rich and Barnes, and so we're very glad that you could be with us today to talk about, what we can do as for ourselves and for loved ones to be prepared. So, thank you.
Yeah. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you to those who are staying for the presentation. And if you are staying and you're not currently seated somewhere that there is a folder and a pen, it might be easier if you move to one of those spaces because there is a couple of writing elements to what we're doing today. But it's nice to meet you all. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Just to give a little bit of background on myself. So, as Pastor Gwynn said, I do work with Jones, Rich and Barnes Funeral Home in Portland, and I also work with Lindquist Funeral Home in Yarmouth. So I cover both locations, and I'm the pre-arrangement advisor for both locations. So what does that mean? That means that anybody who wants to come in and pre-plan for either of those funeral homes has to sit and talk with me. All right? So if that's something you're interested in, I'm the person who would be helping you. But in the state of Maine, that also means that I'm a licensed funeral director. So I've been licensed for several years now. I've only been in Maine for about a year. I moved here from Washington, D.C. last fall.
Were you a funeral director before you came to Maine?
Yes.
Did you get transferred?
I did transfer to a different funeral home when I moved here, but yes. Yeah.
What funeral home before Maine?
Yes, that's a great question. So I worked at Joseph Galler's Sons Funeral Home in Washington, D.C., and that's a very special funeral home. It's one of the oldest in the country. It's been around for almost 180 years. And in that area, they predominantly serve a lot of the large political families in Washington, D.C. So they've done more presidential funerals, more congressmen and women, more Supreme Court justices than any other funeral home in the country. And I was privileged to participate in some of that in the 5.5 years I worked there. So being in D.C., I too have a lot of military funeral experience. I've buried somebody from almost every rank and every branch. Probably have done close to 1,000 military services at Arlington National Cemetery alone. So if you have any questions specifically geared towards veteran funerals, I can answer those as well. So in part of, in my coming to Maine, Pastor Gwynn had talked about some trials and tribulations and whatnot that we all go through, right? And I went through some of that when I moved here. It was a lot of change for me all at once. And I ended up actually switching from meeting with families when they've experienced a death, so at the time of need, to strictly pre-planning. Because I saw that there was a need for that, right? Can't tell you how many times I've sat down with somebody, go check the drawer. Mom came in, she told us she handled everything, she paid for everything. All the decisions are made. Wrong. That's not what happened. You go and you pull the file out of the drawer. There's an estimate from 1985 in there. There are no funds set aside for this service. And all of the options Mom picked, we don't offer anymore because it was in 1985. And now this family, while grieving, now has to come up with the funds to provide these services for their loved one. And they have to think of the answers to all these questions I'm about to ask them while they're in their own head dealing with their emotions, right? So I recognized that there was a problem there, and I wanted to be a part of the solution. And so that's part of why I switched to pre-planning. So first we're going to watch a short video. It's going to give us kind of a good introduction to pre-planning.
If I could give you one piece of advice, pre-plan. It is definitely the way to go. Pre-planning brings the peace of mind to the family at the time of need.
It's like when you pre-plan for your retirement.
Because of the pre-planning, we were able to go through and do the little things that were important to the family and not have to worry about the planning process.
The only thing that I want my family to worry about is be on time.
With pre-planning, you get to bring every detail into it that you want.
It gives you the opportunity to shine the way you want to shine.
We could really concentrate on our mother's wishes, her memory that we wanted to let everybody see.
This way it's not a sad time, it's a happy time.
The casket background was a royal flush. She had a golf club in there, anything that she enjoyed.
They won't have to worry about anything. It might even make them mad. They have no reason to argue, bigger, or anything.
With my father's funeral, we didn't have a pre-planned arrangement in place. And with my mother's, we did, and it made things a lot easier for the family to go through the process. You can just have the peace of mind that everything's taken care of.
I left feeling happy, and and that's exactly how she wanted it.
I think that pre-planning just takes all the guesswork out of the process, that you planned the funeral exactly the way your loved one would want.
All right, so if everybody wants to open up their folders, find, I believe it's on the left side of your folder, it says, how would you rank life's most stressful events? So this exercise is based off of a study that was done by the University of Washington about 20 years ago, and they mailed this survey out to people in the area and asked them to rank these because they wanted to know what people's interpretation or, what level they rank these different things that most of us will go through at some point in our life. All right, so the items on there are loss of a job, death of a loved one, divorce, death of a spouse or a partner, marriage, or personal injury or illness. So go ahead and take a minute, and you're not going to be asked to share aloud, so these answers are private, but go ahead and take a minute and rank those in the order from most stressful to least stressful. So this is what the survey came up with. Number one most stressful event you might face in your life, the death of a spouse or a partner. Number two, divorce. Divorce is like the death of a relationship, right? It's a death in its own way of an entire life that you had with somebody. Divorce is very stressful. 3, death of a loved one. 4, personal injury or illness. Number 5, marriage. Very stressful for some people. And 6, loss of a job, which of course just being on the back end of COVID, I expect several people in here are retired, but I have a lot of friends, they lost jobs during COVID just because of the nature of the pandemic, and that was a big stressor for a lot of people on top of the other things that were going on at that time. So generally speaking, show of hands, did you get most of them kind of ranked in the same order? It's pretty consistent every time we do this presentation, and it's interesting to see too, with the survey having been done several years ago, how much that those same orders have held up. So when a death occurs, and whether you're expecting it, you're not expecting it, obviously we don't necessarily know when that day is going to come, the first thing that your family is going to ask, or that you will ask, is, what now? What do we do now, right? Do you know who to call? Would your family know who to call? Do they know how you might want to be remembered? And where do you start, right? So I'm sure you can imagine, there's a ton of things that have to be done when somebody passes away, but there's so much that it's like information overload, and you don't really know where to start. So in our lives, we're a planning society, we're a planning species, right? We plan for major events all the time, for weddings, for retirement. We get insurances just in case, our house floods or catches on fire. We get, accident indemnity insurance. We get hospital insurance. We get long-term care insurance for these things that might happen, right? But more people than not in the United States fail to plan for the one thing that is universally going to happen to every single one of us in this room. And if it doesn't happen to you, I'd like to know why that is. But people don't plan for their own funerals. They say, let the kids deal with it, you know. Have you been the child of an adult parent who did no planning and you were stuck doing it? Do you want to do that to your kids? Probably not, but I hear it all the time. So, doesn't it make sense to plan for the inevitable? So planning can protect your loved ones from having to make those very important decisions during a stressful time, second guessing what it is that you may have wanted, and then the rising cost of funeral arrangements. When you pre-plan, and I can't say that this is true for every funeral home, but it is true for the funeral homes I work for.
The only thing that I gotta go, but the only thing I wanted to say real quick, the biggest mistake people make is they try to tell their kids not to go to the funeral, and then the child dies.
Yes.
Anybody have a right to go to the funeral. It doesn't matter how old you are, but
yeah,
that's the biggest mistake people make.
There with my dad. He didn't want me to go to the funeral, and I did. I was crying, and a lot of people thought that I just happened, that it happened this year with my dad. My brother didn't want me to go to the funeral, but I wanted to because I was close to my dad, and I lived with him.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I've had lots of families, especially families with young kids or grandkids, say,
Even disability, they say, oh, you don't want to go, you're disabled.
yeah. Well, from the funeral home's perspective, we think that funerals are obviously a valuable experience for anybody to take part in. And, if you've got a kid that says, I don't want to go, don't force them to go, because then they're going to be traumatized from that. But on the other hand, if they say, I want to go, that might be something that's important to that part of closure for that child, and you may be taking that away from them. So that's my 2 cents on that, but that was a great point. So as I was saying, I know that there are funeral homes in the area that don't do this, but something that we do is we lock in the price of your arrangements the day that you make them. So for example, I see old pre-arrangements all the time. People who wrote it late 1990s, early 2000s, now they're passing away. What was a $1,200, $1,500 cremation today to be closer to $6,000 or $7,000. But their family's not going to pay another dime because we locked in their pricing back in 1995 when they came in and had the foresight to pre-plan. So you're locking in today's pricing, and as much as I would love to say that funeral homes are inflation-proof, we still have costs, we still have staff, we still have bills that we have to pay. The merchandise costs go up for us to be able to get that to you. There's no way for us to not be affected by inflation in the same way that you guys are. We put the same gas in the hearse that costs $4 a gallon that you put in your car. So we are not protected from that. But by pre-planning, you have the opportunity to protect yourself and your family against that inflation. So pre-planning takes 4 simple steps. 1, reflect. 2, record. 3, secure. And 4, share. So I like to think that if you haven't done all 4 of these steps, you're not done pre-planning yet. We're going to go through those. Step 1, reflect. Think about how you might want to be remembered. Is there anybody in this room who has never given a thought to their own funeral? Exactly. We've all started thinking about this. It's impossible to not think about it. When you do think about it, how do you want to be remembered? And what should your service say about your life, right? We've changed the language in the last 15 years or so from funeral to celebration of life, right? Funerals and memorials are not what they used to be. I'm sure you all remember walking into a funeral home. It's dark. There's a wall of flowers at the front surrounding a casket. There aren't any windows open. All the curtains are closed. There's some drab organ playing in the background. And, oh, Mom, she looks so nice. And then they go and sit down in the pew. It's not like that anymore. Some families don't even have visitation. People have really shifted from this sense of forced mourning at a funeral, and we're going to make it as sad as we possibly can so everybody's just as sad as we are, to, the windows are open, there's bright colors, there might not be an open casket at the front of the room, there might not even be an urn at the front of the room. Instead of everybody crying, you're listening to the person's favorite music or sharing their favorite snacks. You're really celebrating who that person was. People say, I want to have a party. I want them to have a party. That's what people are doing now. If you want to have a super sad, curtains closed funeral, that's totally up to you. But it is not the norm these days. And a good first question to ask yourself is, do you wish to be buried or cremated? It never fails to shock me. I'll meet with somebody in their 70s or 80s and they say, I don't know. They have no idea what it is that they want for themselves. And it's really important that if you don't do any of these other steps, please tell your kids, tell your spouse, tell whoever is responsible to take care of your arrangements when you pass away. At least answer the question, do you want to be cremated or do you want to be buried? Because if that question hasn't been answered, we can't start anything at the funeral home. We can't move forward at all. Don't leave that decision up to them. Step 2, record. So by recording, by writing down what it is that you want, having it on paper somewhere, you're eliminating that guesswork for your family. So over here I've got a couple of examples. We have 2 types of personal planning guides. One is our basic personal planning guide. The other one is our veterans planning guide. Do we have any veterans in the room?
Well, my husband was.
Yeah, so as I'm sure you know, there's a lot of paperwork involved if you want a veteran funeral, even to get a flag. There's a lot of paperwork involved. But these 2 guides, when filled out properly, are about 95%.
Didn't get done right.
About 75% of the questions that your family is going to be asked when you pass away and that the funeral home will need the answer to, usually within about 24 to 48 hours. It moves pretty quick. My colleague, Matt, he tells a story. He's done pre-planning up in the Lewiston, Auburn area at Fortin Group for 20 plus years now. He always tells the story when he does this presentation. There was a lady, he helped with their funeral, cremated her husband, and she is like, well, I hope I did the right thing. They had this whole service. She felt really good about her decision, but they didn't pre-plan because he never wanted to talk about it. You get that sometimes. One person's like, yeah, let's do it. And the other person says, nope, we're not talking about it. Don't want to talk about it. So while going through his things, donating his clothes, getting rid of things, in his underwear drawer with some important papers, there's a letter to her. It says, I don't care what you do, but don't cremate me.
Oh.
And she came back to the funeral home and was talking, I believe the funeral director, his name was Kevin, talking to Kevin, distraught, because she had done the one thing that her husband had asked her. Now, he never told her directly, don't do this. Never told her that paper was there. But in her mind, she had done the one thing that he had asked her not to do. Not a mind reader. Exactly. And neither are your families. They're not mind readers either. But she was distraught. And what is the one? You can't undo a cremation, right? If it had been the other one.
Jesus can.
Yes, Jesus can. That's true. I don't usually give this presentation at church. So yes, Jesus can.
Jesus can do anything.
You sure can. Now, if he had been buried and the note said, don't bury me, I want to be cremated, you can unbury somebody and cremate them, but you can't uncremate them and bury them, right? So that's just a little anecdote of what could happen, right, if you don't write it down and share that you've written it down. So for the veterans in the room, VA burial benefits. We're going to cover this a little bit quick. So National Cemetery System, there are state cemeteries, veteran cemeteries, and there are federally run veteran cemeteries. So the cemetery in Springdale, which is like the closest one to southern Maine, that's a state-run cemetery. Arlington National Cemetery or Quantico, those are federally run veteran cemeteries. If you have a DD-214 and you served honorably, and you were not dishonorably discharged, you do qualify. With cemeteries like Arlington, because they're running out of room, their requirements are getting stricter and stricter and stricter by the year, and there's an incredible wait time. Yeah, when I left DC a year ago, it was 14 to 18 months for an urn and 10 to 12 months for a casket.
We waited 20 months for an urn.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, and what, branch you're a part of makes a difference. Is it the veteran? Is it the spouse? All those things make a difference because they only have limited resources, and the more things that you're asking for, the further out they have to push it so they can guarantee that all those things are going to line up on the same day. So there is a lot to that. But as a regardless of if you are buried at a veteran cemetery or at a private cemetery, which a lot of folks are, you are eligible for a government marker for your grave. There are a few different options. Usually you'll have to pay a small installation fee at the cemetery for that, but if you're buried at the veteran cemetery, then no, you don't have to pay for that. Also, at the veteran cemetery, if required, they will provide a grave liner to you. If you're buried at a private cemetery, that's a cost that's usually going to start at about $1,895. That's $1,895 or so for that grave liner. And perpetual care. Perpetual care is for pretty much most cemeteries. Some of these smaller cemeteries in the area, doesn't look like they're really getting the perpetual care that they need. But typically when you purchase a plot of land, you're paying in part for the land itself, and the rest of the funds are going into what's called an endowment account. And that endowment account is going to continue to pay for the care of the land, to have a landscaper, to have a cemetery manager indefinitely. So everybody who purchases a plot pays into that. It's taken care of by the government at a veteran cemetery. And knowing where your DD 214 is very important. That is the key to any veteran's benefit that you need. And on the short end, it usually takes about 2 months to get a copy of that. On the long end, 8 or 9 months from the National Archives. So if you need one of those, you don't know where yours is, let's go ahead and order it for you now. So it's already getting processed. Step 3, secure. So in my opinion, a prearranged funeral that has no funds behind it is not truly prearranged, right? You've made the decisions, but you've also made the decision to leave it up to your kids to pay for that once you've passed away. And most funeral homes, almost all funeral homes, require payment in full prior to services taking place. You can't undo a funeral. You can't uncremate somebody, we've already established, unless you're Jesus. And most funeral homes will want that. So when you think about it, with the cremation starting roughly around $6,000 on average, to a full burial with a casket, usually between $12,000 and $18,000, you've made that decision to let your kids come up with that $12,000 to $18,000 within days of your passing, right? So a file, arrangements that have not been paid for, in my opinion, are not secured. So you are locking in today's pricing. Some funeral homes will offer you funding options. I know at our funeral home, you can make monthly payments with a small down payment for up to 5 years, no interest, no finance charges, no penalty if you pay it off early. And with it being such a large expense, that's usually helpful for some people. Not everybody can just write that check for $15,000 and not think twice about it. But they can make a $150 a month payment, right? So know what your options are. And so that's securing your convenient payment terms, and you're easing that financial burden. And one question I usually get, which I'm surprised nobody popped up and said, what about life insurance? How many people in here have life insurance? Okay, we got a few. Lots of people think that life insurance is to pay for your funeral, right? Wrong. That's not really what life insurance is for. Life insurance is to help those who are left behind continue their way of living. If a husband is passed and left his wife a life insurance policy, should she be spending a good portion of that on the funeral, or should that go towards replacing his income, paying those mortgage payments? If they have a vehicle that they have to make payments on, taking care of that, going into a grandchild's college fund. I mean, life insurance really is not meant to pay for a service. And going back to how funeral homes do require payment prior to services, it can take 2, 3, 4 weeks before you're going to get that life insurance payout. Yes, ma'am?
If you have a trust already set up for a funeral, can you change the funeral director?
Yes, it depends. It depends. So,
And if so, how do you do that?
in the state of Maine, it's called a mortuary trust. And you can have a revocable mortuary trust or an irrevocable mortuary trust.
Oh, I wonder what
I also wonder what you have, because if it's irrevocable, yes, well, I guess if it's either, yes, you can change it to a different funeral home, but you can't, if it's irrevocable, you can't take the funds back out of that account. So they can be transferred to a different funeral home, but they can't,
It can be transferred.
it can't be
That's all.
canceled, but it can be transferred. Lots of people, unfortunately, do find themselves in a position where they have to apply for Medicare or for Maine care. And actually, this is a good place to bring this up. When you are applying for Maine care, they want you to spend down your assets immediately. Because if you have liquid assets, what do you need Maine care for? Right? So they're going to strip you of all of your assets pretty much And first thing they'll tell you to do is go to a funeral home and set up an irrevocable mortuary trust. The limit currently is about $12,000 as to what you can put in that account, and it's protected. Beginning of next year, it goes up to $18,000. And so that's, I mean, they haven't changed that limit in about 15 years, but the cost of funerals have continued to go up. So that is now the limit. But that protects that money from being taken from the state. It helps you spend down that money quick so that you can get your application in and get the care that you need, and then your family doesn't have to worry about it, right? And then the government's not taking it because who wants them to take more of our money? So being mindful of revocable versus irrevocable. 99% of the contracts that I write are revocable, mostly.
It's irrevocable, I know.
So they are revocable because I want my clients to be in control of their funds and in control of their choices literally until the day that they die, unless there's like a Maine care situation where they have to make it irrevocable. You may decide, you want to be cremated 5 years after you've done your contract. You may have changed your mind. You should be able to come in and change your mind and apply those funds to a new contract. You might decide, or there might be a family emergency, and you need access to that $10,000 in that trust fast because you have to take care of something. You call me, I get you to write a letter, and we give you your money back. $10,000 check. Here you go. It's your money. You stay in control. And step 4, share. So you're informing your loved ones of your wishes, making sure that it's not tucked on a piece of paper in your underwear drawer for somebody to never find. You keep copies of your planning documents in a filing cabinet or wherever you're keeping, those documents you want secure, your important files. And let your loved ones know where those documents are. I was just in California visiting my dad last week, and I said to him, I haven't lived at home for almost 10 years. I don't know where anything is anymore. I need you to put everything in one place and tell me where that place is. Because if something happens to you tomorrow, I'm never going to be able to find it. I need you to let me know where it is. Let your family know where those documents are. And include your religious, your legal, and healthcare professionals. If you live at a facility, make sure that they have a copy of what it is that you want or that you've prearranged for yourself. So if your kids lose their copy or can't find yours, there's somewhere else they can get it. Have those conversations with your pastor ahead of time in terms of music or selections that you might want for readings or just generally speaking what it is that you want so there's somebody else in the know. It can't all stay here because that's going to go with you too. Pre-planning is a wise decision, and most importantly, it is a decision that shows that you care. It is a gift that you can give to them to not be burdened by your passing financially or emotionally, right? Like the lady said in the video, they just have to show up, Pre-planning really came in handy during the pandemic. And having worked in Washington, D.C. when that was going on, it's a very transient area. People live there for a short amount of time for work, and their families spread out everywhere. The families who were pre-planned had the easiest time because they maybe had one document they had to sign via DocuSign. They didn't have to come into the funeral home. They didn't have to do a Zoom call with me. They didn't have to do anything. We were able to take care of it because it was taken care of. And if pandemic showed us anything, we never know what's going to happen, right? So you're providing your family and yourself with peace of mind, protecting them from financial burden, and you're ensuring that your wishes are your wishes. So when you're looking for a funeral home provider, these are a couple things that are specific to our funeral home. Can't really speak to if other funeral homes offer these. Most don't. But highest standards of service with a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Say you pre-plan your service, or even if not, you come in and you feel like something with the service was messed up, like we heard a little bit earlier, something wasn't done right. Okay, that's fine. That portion of the service you're getting a refund on. If the stationery is messed up, we're going to redo that stationery for you and give you your money back, right? As much as every funeral director I know wishes that they were 100% perfect, never made a mistake, we're human, and it happens. I've made mistakes as a funeral director, and it kills me every time I do, but it happens. But I can promise you that if it does happen in our funeral home, we're going to do what we can to make it right. And if we can't make it right, you're going to get your money back. Protection when away from home. So how many people in here still travel pretty frequently, more than 75 miles or so from here? Okay. So if something were to happen to you, let's say you are somebody who likes to go to Florida in the winter, like many people in Maine do, and you pass away in Florida. We have a protection for you. It's a one-time $499 fee called Away from Home Protection. That basically protects you. If you pass away in Florida, any costs associated with getting you back to Maine are covered by that policy. For example, let's say you want to be buried here. You die in Florida. We're going to have to hire another funeral home to bring you into their care, to get you ready for your flight, to do the death certificate, to take you to the airport, and to get you up here. The ticket alone for your body to come back to Maine is almost $1,000, let alone the fees from the funeral home, which are probably $2,000 or $3,000, just for bringing you into their care and doing the death certificate, taking you to the airport.
If I'm dead, I don't need to fly first class.
It is not first class.
Cremated in Florida, it's still expensive to fly the remains back.
Yes, so if you're cremated, you would ship the remains via USPS. The only way you can legally send ashes in the United States. But in that sort of a situation, okay, it doesn't make so you want a direct cremation, you don't want any services, you die in Florida, we can get you cremated in Florida and then have your remains shipped to your next of kin. You don't necessarily have to come back, but that fee is going to protect you. And it's also international. The one time that I have used that as a director, the woman actually got the same policy through her job. And she was on vacation in Thailand, and she had a freak scuba diving accident and died. It took us about 3.5 weeks to get her back, and that $499 fee covered about $12,000 worth of expenses. Wow. They hired translators, they had a fly-in and embalmer from China, they didn't have embalmers where she was, dealt with the medical examiner, dealt with all the permits, everything. I just had to call and check every day to make sure I knew what I needed to know to tell the family. So something worth thinking about if you do travel. Bereavement, travel, and grief support. So some of you remember the times where, oh, grandma died, we have to get a flight. You call American Airlines or Delta, and you try to get them to book you, on a bereavement flight, right? A little bit of a discount, usually a little bit easier. They do not offer that anymore. Airlines will not help you. They're too inundated with all of the other things they're doing to help you. We have hired a team through Carlson Wagonly, and it's a dedicated team just for our company who, if somebody in your family or you call this phone number, they are serving only our families, and they will make those travel arrangements for you, usually at a discounted cost if they can. So you have access to that. And it's not just for the service. It's used for up to 1 year if you're coming back to settle an estate or anything like that. You and your family are covered. Programs to help loved ones even after the funeral. We are in the process of getting one of our advocacy groups back running now that somebody's in this position again more permanently. And for a long time we did have a grief support group for those who had recently lost somebody, and it was called the LIFT program. And they would go on little outings. They'd go to bingo night, or they'd go to lunch, they'd go to the beach with people who were experiencing the same sort of thing as them. We also offer what's called a compassion care line, and that is a free counselor with a master's degree level education or higher on the other end of that phone number for free, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for the first 13 months after you've experienced a loss. Unlimited use. And the most people who use that are men, and it's between the hours of midnight and 3 a.m. Yep. You lost your spouse. Your life is entirely different. You want to call your kids in the middle of the night, wake them up to talk to them. What are you going to do? Not talk to anybody about what you're feeling? So that is something that we offer to our families. And then, of course, community education with licensed and trained advisors, like myself. So we are a part of a larger network. We've got about 2,000 funeral homes across the United States and Canada, and that allows us to, in that situation where you pass in Florida, we can transfer your arrangements to one of our funeral homes in Florida. Or if you move more than 75 miles away from your current address, say you move to Boston, great. You don't have to go to another funeral home and do another thing. At the time when you pass away, they'll call us, we'll transfer it to them. Family's not going to be charged another $1. You're still protected by that pricing. So, of course, we want to support the communities where we live. We work, we raise our families. We are very involved in all things community service. And our goals are always, of course, to honor the people that we're serving, to keep their families safe, and to comfort those who grieve. All right, so before we get to our Q&A, everybody wants to open up your folder, and you'll see what is called an advanced planning worksheet. So it's a carbon copy. I take the white copy, so you keep the yellow copy, and this is how I get credit for being here today. So it's really important that I get at least a few of these back from you guys. So go ahead and take that out, and I'm going to walk you through it. So first line, would I prefer burial or cremation? If you don't know what it is that you prefer, then please put a question mark. You don't necessarily have to have the answers to these questions today. Number 2, if you want to be buried, do you have an idea of what kind of casket you might like? Do you want wood? Do you want metal? Do you want, a green burial, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, or something else? If you want to be cremated, same thing. Do you want a wood urn, metal urn, porcelain, something else? And for your visitation, do you even want a visitation? If you do you want one day? Do you want half day? Do you want multiple days? Select your choice. And ceremony. If you want a ceremony, is it something you would want at the funeral home? Do you want it here at the church? Do you want it at, if you're planning on being buried in a different city, is there a church in that other city you want it buried at, or you want your service at? Go ahead and make a selection. Or just graveside. Lots of people do just a graveside service. And national cemetery, private cemetery, or other, you could make your selection there. And a show of hands, based on our conversation today, who has 100% fully pre-planned everything? Okay, good job. Good job. So, yeah, I assumed you in the back you did because you asked the question about the trust. So if you have prepaid for your cemetery arrangements only, check that. If you have a travel protection plan, check that. If you paid for your funeral or cremation arrangements, check that. If you're a veteran, you can go ahead and mark your branch of service, and if you know where your DD-214 is. We also, too, there's a spot if you're a member of a veteran service organization, you can write that down. We do have endorsements from both the VFW and American Legion. And then next, I want you in the box here to check if you would like a copy of that Veterans Planning Guide or that Personal Planning Guide. Yes, ma'am.
Do spouses have any benefits for veteran spouse?
Are they
100% disabled?
Are they buried at a veteran cemetery?
No.
Then no.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we actually do these presentations, but strictly on veterans burials because there's a lot of misunderstanding about who qualifies for what, and about 60% of veterans think the military is just going to pay for your service, and that is not how that works. But no, there aren't any spouse benefits if you're not buried at a veteran cemetery. So mark if you'd like the Veterans Planning Guide, if you would like to have a Personal Planning Guide, and then your contact information. At least a name and an email or a phone number, because what I like to do when I get these back is based on the selections that you've made, cremation, burial, whatever. I put together one of these folders, and I put information that's relevant to you in that folder along with your planning guides, and we'll set up a time to get those to you. There's no obligation. It doesn't mean that you're going to use our funeral home or anything, but it's my job to get that information to you. So if you could please put your contact information, and if you're ready to go ahead and set up a time now, if you've got your calendar with you, for me to get that to you, I've got mine, so we can do that today, or I can give you a call next week to set up something that's convenient for both of us. And you can fill in, best time to meet, best day to meet, etc. So there were a couple of questions that Pastor Gwen had emailed to me that I'm going to go over, and then I'll open it up to any additional questions from everybody else if you want to continue to fill that out. So, question number 1, is embalming required for cremation? No. Embalming is not required for burial either. Legally, via the FTC, a funeral home cannot require you to embalm. It's against the law. There are certain circumstances under which we can require you to embalm, but generally speaking, no. So if you want to be cremated, you do not have to go through that process. But that's not to say that there aren't families who do. because with cremation, most people don't know, you can do literally every single thing the same from funeral home to cemetery that you would with a burial. There's just one additional stop in there at the crematory before you get to the cemetery. You can have an open casket visitation. You can have your casket with your physical body present at the church. You can be embalmed, and then you can be cremated, and then you can be buried or returned to your family. Really, it's that one stop of difference. So if that's something that you feel very strongly about, but you want to be cremated, you can kind of have it both ways.
That's where you would rent a casket.
Yes. Yeah, not all funeral homes will let you rent a casket. I've worked at funeral homes that don't. Jones & Rich and Lindquist, we do have rental caskets. Some families do purchase a casket, though, and their loved one is cremated in it. And it blows my mind every time. But, oh, yeah. But a rental casket, you wouldn't know that that's what it is unless you were a funeral director. And even then, it's pretty hard to tell. So it's very seamless looking, and that's a good option that can save a little bit of money for families.
I was a woodworker, and I was told I could build my own casket if I wanted to.
Sure can. Once again, protected by the FTC. You are not required to purchase a casket from the funeral home. We can't make you do that. But if you choose to purchase your own casket, which you can get them on like Walmart.com, you can get them from Costco, seriously. If you choose to do that, we're going to have you sign a waiver that says if there's anything wrong with that casket or anything goes wrong with that casket, we're not liable. I've had hundreds of families purchase their own casket and it went just fine, and I've had situations where the casket lock was broken and the casket has to be locked or sealed to be buried, and we had to cancel their service and reschedule it for another day because we legally could not bury that casket. So, obviously, if it's a casket we've sold you, we can upgrade your casket. We can get you into something else at no additional cost. We've got warranties that can cover those sorts of things. But you buy it from Costco, all bets are off.
I actually saw caskets on Costco's ad today.
So you can also, too, you can donate your body to science. Get a lot of questions about donating your body. You can sign up for it in advance. It's almost never a situation where, okay, mom was on hospice care, she just died. Let me make my initial contact with the university to see if they'll come and get her. That is not how that works. And they're not going to file a death certificate either. So funeral home still has to be involved.
Except during COVID.
What do you mean?
When my husband died during COVID, his body could not go for medical purposes.
Yep. Yeah. So COVID, they pretty much took nobody during COVID, and that's kind of a universal thing across the board. But even as you get older, certain medications that you're on, certain ailments that you have, they might not take you at all. That could be your plan your entire life, and you die in a car accident. And your body is so damaged that you're not of any use for medical research. They're not going to take you, So there are a lot of factors into body donation. Same thing if you're an organ donor on your driver's license. Most people who are marked as an organ donor live long enough to where their organs would not be useful, right? Because of ailments, disease, age, etc. So it is an option for some people, but if that's something you're interested in, I suggest reaching out to a program now.
How does the body and the organ donation people talk to each other?
The body donation and organ donation, those are two separate things.
Right.
So let's say you pass the hospital, you're donating organs. The funeral home will not come and pick you up until those organs have been harvested. Funeral home's not involved in that process. We get the call afterwards, and the hospital will coordinate that. If you have set up in advance that you want your body to be donated, when you die, call the funeral home. The funeral home will usually pick you up. So the programs don't have the staff necessary to just be going out all over the place to bring you into their care. And we would then, if they wanted to move forward with accepting your body for donation, then we would transport you.
So you can't really do both?
Usually not.
Okay.
Very rarely. Very rarely. But there are some places, too, like when I was in D.C., we worked with Georgetown Medical Hospital a lot, and they had a donation program specifically for people who died of Alzheimer's for brain extraction. And we worked with them all the time. But there's a time frame, even for regular body donation, because they have to preserve you with fluids we don't have at the funeral home, and that has to be done in a very, very short order. Yes?
So I have arranged to donate my body, and my understanding is that they would cremate me, and their burial is on their campus. Is there any way to tweak that? And
program. So every program will have that. That's not like a state law thing. Every program will have a different way that they do it. You could ask them if they could return the ashes to your family, or
I think they will. I made this a long time ago, and
yeah.
one thing from today is I need to refresh.
Yeah, exactly. And it's very possible that some of their requirements have changed. You might not even qualify anymore. But it is important to denote if you have the option whether or not you want them to dispose of the ashes after they cremate you or to send you back home to your family. Let's see, we talked about that. Green burial. Is there anybody in here that's particularly interested in green burial? Can you say what it is? Yeah, so I'll give a little overview. Green burial is burial that is eco-conscious, right? So usually green cemeteries are pieces of land that have been conserved from a larger forest area, and they're protected indefinitely because it's now a burial ground. But instead of your traditional 6 to 8 feet buried, you're going to be about 3 feet. And you might not be in a casket. They might not even allow caskets. You might be in a shroud. You might be in a wicker casket, which I have seen. You might be in something that's just solely wood construction, no metal. So there are options there. There is no embalming. Usually ashes can be buried in a green cemetery. Very few say that you can't have ashes in a green cemetery. But you have 3 options in Maine. There's Cedar Brook and Leamington, Rainbows Inn in Orrington, and then Baldwin Hill and Fayette. So you have 3 options for green burial. I do believe that the plots at Cedar Brook average about $1,400 each. That was the last quote that I got, so I assume the others are pretty close to that. But
And then you're like buried under a tree? Like
sometimes, not necessarily. And then you wouldn't necessarily have a traditional headstone or marker. It might be like something that looks more like a rock that has a plaque on it or an engraving. So there are some pretty strict requirements for it, but ultimately it is the best option for the environment. So actually, I went to Pepperdine University in Los Angeles. It's a religious school, and I had a sustainability and Christianity class, and I wrote a paper in college on what is the most eco-conscious and sustainable version of final disposition, keeping, the earth in mind, right? Because God obviously wants us to take care of the planet.
Amen.
And green burial, that is your best option. But it can still be expensive, and cremation is the next best option. That's not something you want. Yes, ma'am.
When my brother-in-law died, we dug a big hole. We had a celebration of life in our front yard. We dug a big hole and we ordered a green seedling tree, and we buried his ashes in our front yard. We'd go by and say, "It's George's tree." George's tree is humongous now. It needs to be trimmed. So that's what we did there. My girlfriend passed away in Arizona, and I was everything to her. I was her power of attorney, and her ashes were delivered to my home. And her choice was to be either buried on a beach or preferably on a golf course. I looked
not to be buried, but just to have
to be
scattered.
I looked online, and it said there were no ordinances of what I needed to do. When I looked online, this was how many years ago? 4 times.
You're generally speaking, you're correct. There aren't a lot of real ordinances. Okay, as a licensed funeral director, it's my job to tell you those are human remains, and you should technically have a permit and permission to scatter wherever it is that you're doing that. Is there a ash scattering policeman walking around southern Maine checking out to see if that's what people are doing?
Jill and I went for a lovely walk around the golf course.
Yeah.
So who would the permit be issued by?
It's a burial and disposition permit that the funeral home receives regardless. So technically it would be covered underneath that permit. So
you would have to ask a municipality, hey, can we?
No, I wouldn't. Don't complicate things for
We
us.
didn't do anything. We
Yeah.
went for a lovely walk. I had her in an LL Bean bag.
That's how most people do it.
I had gloves on, and we walked for a long walk, and every time I come to the corner of Muzzy Road, Broadway and Westford Street, I talked to her. That's what she wanted.
Yeah.
I mean, it's rained and it snowed, and she's on the golf course, and I'm happy, and she's with God, and she's happy. And that's what we did. I didn't I just got online to see if it was okay if I do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are some. Every state, so there's like federal, the FTC rules are the only federal rules regarding anything having to do with funeral service, and then every state has very specific laws. So in Maine, for example, you can't get funeral insurance, which a lot of other states you can. You can only do mortuary trusts. I'm sure there are states that have some very sort of strict, like, ashes law. Maine does not. My general rule is, you're doing it in a public place or on private property that does not belong to you, ask permission or be very discreet.
We were discreet.
Be very discreet. You know, I will say, I have heard Disneyland is like the one place where they will kick you out. If they see if you're going to put grandma on the fountain, they will kick you out. My grandfather's in the Bellagio fountain. He's in Galveston. He's in New Mexico. He's in California. I have a tattoo that has some of his ashes in the ink. He's everywhere. So, do with that information what
water, is it any different?
With water, I think technically you're supposed to be out like 1 nautical mile, but nobody's going to stop you. People scatter right off the beach all the time. I would say flowing water is a better move if you have access to it. But there are urns specifically made for scattering. As I'm sure you can imagine, it can be a very messy process sometimes. And so we actually make scattering urns that help with a more even distribution. Don't, you know, if it's a windy day, maybe wait another day. But yeah, there are also urns that dissolve. We have urns that are made of Himalayan rock salt or gelatin or sand that will sink to the bottom of the body of water, and it will dissolve over time. It usually takes about 2 days for it to fully dissolve, and as it dissolves, the ashes will disperse, and they're at a lower depth, so you don't have to worry about them all floating on top of the water. There are services here in Maine that will take you out on a boat and scatter you. I mean, legally, you can even be buried at sea, technically. That is an option. There's some permitting for that, but take you out a couple of nautical miles, and they have to put, I think, cinder blocks in your casket to weigh it down. They have to drill holes in the bottom of your casket, but they will push you off the end of a boat, and you will sink to the end of the ocean. I mean, that is a possibility. That's totally legal. Yeah, there are a lot of options. And with cremation specifically, there are way more things that you can do than you can with a casketed body. You can turn ashes into fireworks or a coral reef. I've turned ashes to space. I've turned ashes into diamonds. I mean, you can really do a lot of things with ashes. Okay, rules for scattering ashes. So biggest cost savings, planning ahead. I mean, ultimately, that is your biggest cost savings because you're protecting against whatever those future prices are. So that's your biggest cost savings. Generally speaking, a direct cremation with no services is going to be your least expensive way to go, or what's called an immediate burial. An immediate burial is basically the same thing as a direct cremation, but funeral home does paperwork, gets your death certificate. You do have the additional purchase of a casket. We take you to the cemetery, the casket's lowered, and we leave. Whatever you do after that is up to you. If you want a pastor or a priest to come, or your family wants to say a few words, that's fine, but the funeral home is only there to cover what our licensure requires, and that's to see that the casket is lowered into the grave. So we're not really there to assist with anything with the graveside service. Yes, ma'am?
Do you have an irrevocable trust in place? Can you add to it or change it?
This depends on the funeral home, if they will do it or not. Generally speaking, yes. You just can't get any money back out of it. So if you want to make changes that put money into it, sure. Technically, like if you were changing from cremation to burial, you're not really supposed to do that. But I don't personally see anything wrong with it. It's funeral home preference. But yes, you can make changes. But let's say you wanted services that equaled out, $1,200. You don't want that anymore. Funeral home still has to legally keep that $1,200. But yeah, so your biggest cost savings, direct cremation or immediate burial, that's not what most families want. And even families who come to the funeral home for direct cremation, something like 40-50% of them end up still doing something on their own. It's just whether or not the funeral home is involved. So if the funeral home is involved, your cost is going to be higher. But in exchange for that cost, you have somebody in the parking lot helping to guide cars or to show people where the restroom is. You don't have to find somebody who's with the church or a family member to stand at the guest book and have people sign or pass out programs or bring people water. You don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. But if there's a casket present, even if you were having a church service, there is no not having the funeral home, because anywhere that there is a deceased human body, a funeral director has to be legally. So that's going to be your biggest cost savings, but ultimately, regardless of what you want to do, you'll save the most if you pay for it in advance.
So if you have the funeral home put the casket in the grave, then they leave. I mean, does the cemetery then fill it in, or do you have to bring shovels? Or?
No. So the cemetery, that's a great question. Cemetery is separate from the funeral home. Part of what you're paying for at the cemetery, and usually they don't let you pay for this part in advance, is the opening and closing of the grave. And for a casket, that's usually between $1,200 and $1,700. For an urn, $500 to $1,200. And that covers them coming and digging the grave before you get there, and then closing the grave once you leave. Yeah. And the funeral home will coordinate that for you. And that's something you can put funds for in your prearrangement, but that's one of the very few costs that we cannot guarantee. So anything that is a cost that we don't decide, we can't guarantee. So I say we lock in your prices, but we can't guarantee that death certificates won't go up, or permits from the medical examiner, or cemetery, or obituary. That's the biggest culprit. Somebody, an obituary 10 years ago was $300. Yeah, try $1,200 today. So that's kind of your biggest question mark on those, but you can put funds there. So there's $500 to start, and then there may be a small balance. So cost difference between funeral home and church service. On our end, there's no different fee. I spoke with Pastor Gwen shortly before we started. If you're a member here, there aren't costs associated with having a service. If you're not a member, it's on a sliding scale. But generally speaking, most churches do have some sort of a fee structure. It's usually about $250 for the priest and $150 for each musician, and potentially a use of space fee as well. So something to keep in mind, but if you're having a casketed or an urn service that the funeral home is present at, it is not a difference in cost with our funeral home, whether it's here or whether it's at the funeral home. Casket costs, your casket costs are generally, if you're not buying them online, having them sent to the funeral home, generally going to start at about $1,500 and can go pretty much the sky's the limit from up there. I think our most expensive casket is like $17K. Funeral home I worked at in DC, their most expensive casket was $100,000. So it really depends on where you were at. But our range is about $1,500 to $17,000. And urns run about $95 to $1,295. So there's lots of options in that in between, and most people fall kind of right there in the mean and the average of those numbers. But once again, these are things you can get on your own, or you can build your own. Reception costs. Reception costs will be different. We have caterers that we work with. If you're having a service at the church, oftentimes the church will put on a reception for the family. If you want something catered at your house, or if you want something at a restaurant, it's going to be at a higher cost. But our catering packages, I think, start somewhere around $500 and go up from there. They're customizable. Not every funeral home offers catering, though. So something to keep in mind. And then there was a question, too, that was presented, cost varying between the local funeral homes. There is some variance, but, I mean, they're pretty close to one another. It's not a distinguishable variance, in my opinion, but, there are reasons for cost differences, depending on what things your facility offers that another facility might not offer. If your funeral home does live streaming of your service at no additional cost, but the other funeral home has to pay somebody to come in and do that for them, then that part of it's going to be more expensive. So there's kind of an ebb and a flow between different funeral homes. Some are usually a little bit higher on this, some are a little higher on this, but it all evens out for the most part at the end. Direct cremation providers are a thing that exists. They are not funeral homes. Legally, by their state licensure, they are a funeral home, but it's usually a storefront operation. People are there Monday through Friday, maybe, and they've got a lot of demand, so you might not get a call back in 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, because they're serving so many families that they don't have enough staff to be able to get back to your family quickly. Because they're storefront operations, if your family decides they want a service, they can't have it there because it's literally just a little office, So they're very, very limited in what they can provide. They are the least expensive options, but your family is not going to be supported in the same way through that process. And there are some people who can only afford to go that way, and that's perfectly fine. And those families, we will direct to a direct cremation provider, because it's not ethical for us to say, well, why don't we just discount it a little bit to keep you here? No, that's not the right thing to do, so we're not going to do that. But that is the option that some people have to choose. Some people choose that because it's what they want. They don't care. You know, it's up to you. It's a very personal choice. So that was all the questions that I pulled from Pastor Gwynn's email to me. Are there any questions from any of you that I can answer? That's a lot of information.
I would just add that, having gone through this a couple of times in the last few years, that having professional funeral directors at a time that's really stressful it's really helpful to have somebody who does this every day and can keep track of the details for you when your mind's a little scattered.
Yeah. And funny, not funny enough, during the pandemic, when there was these are the people who were essential workers list came out from the Department of Defense, I think it was. Guess who was not on it? Funeral directors. Our national membership organization, who lobbies in Congress, had to go fight for us. This sickness that's going to kill all these people. Who's going to get them? Who's going to bury them? They didn't even think about that. Funeral directors are very often left off that list, so I appreciate that. And it's in a lot of ways, I say I'm a Jacqueline of many trades. I'm a seamstress. I've had to fix somebody's clothes on the fly. I do hair, I do makeup, I embalm. I pre-plan funerals. I'm an event planner. I can plan an elaborate service. I have a crematory operator license. I'm a professor. I teach mortuary school. So, there are funeral directors who get that license and they do the bare minimum and that's all they do. And personally, I don't find them to be that helpful, but the majority really do care about their communities. And let me tell you, this is not a job that you decide to do if you want to make people's lives harder than they already are or to take advantage of people. There are way easier jobs to do if that's what you're trying to do. The people who are doing this job are doing it because they care about their community and they feel called to what it is that they're doing. Anybody else? Any questions? Okay. You are welcome. Thanks so much for having me, everybody. Appreciate it. And like I said, I just need the top sheet back from the 2-page sheet. And if you've left your contact information, I'll get in touch with you just to get you your information and answer any questions you may have. Your situation might be different than somebody else's, so if you want to do the evaluation form, you can, but that is not required.
How do you spell your last name?
S-Y-P, Peter, H-A